In general, the physical and mental form of conscious beings is an expression of the character of the planet on which they live. On certain very large and aqueous planets, for instance, we found that civilization had been achieved by marine organisms. On these huge globes, no land dwellers as large as man could possibly thrive, for gravitation would have nailed them to the ground. But in the water there was no such limitation to bulk. One peculiarity of these big worlds was that, owing to the crushing action of gravitation, there were seldom any great elevations and depressions in their surface. Thus they were usually covered by a shallow ocean, broken here and there by archipelagos of small low islands. I shall describe one example of this kind of world, the greatest planet of a mighty sun. Situated, if I remember rightly, near the congested heart of the galaxy, this star was born late in galactic history, and it gave birth to planets when already many of the older stars were encrusted with smoldering lava. Owing to the violence of solar radiation, its nearer planets had, or will have, stormy climates. On one of these, a mollusk-like creature, living in the coastal shallows, acquired a propensity to drift in its boat-like shell on the sea's surface, thus keeping in touch with drifting vegetable food. As the ages passed, its shell became better adapted to navigation. Mere drifting was supplemented by means of a crude sail, a membrane extending from the creature's back. In time, this nautiloid type proliferated into a host of species. Some of these remained minute, but some found size advantageous and developed into living ships. One of these became the intelligent master of this great world. The whole was a rigid, streamlined vessel, shaped much as the 19th century clipper in her prime, and larger than our largest whale. At the rear, a tentacle or fin developed into a rudder, which was sometimes used also as a propeller, like a fish's tail. But though all these species could navigate under their own power to some extent, their normal means of long-distance locomotion was their great spread of sail. The simple membranes of the ancestral type had become a system of parchment-like sails and bony masts and spars, under voluntary muscular control. Similarity to a ship was increased by the downward-looking eyes, one on each side of the prow. The mainmast head also bore eyes for searching the horizon. An organ of magnetic sensitivity in the brain afforded a reliable means of orientation. At the fore end of the vessel were two long manipulatory tentacles which during locomotion were folded snugly to the flanks. In use they formed a very serviceable pair of arms. It may seem strange that a species of this kind should have developed human intelligence. In more than one world of this type, however, a number of accidents combined to produce this result. The change from a vegetarian to a carnivorous habit caused a great increase in animal cunning in pursuit of the much speedier submarine creatures. The sense of hearing was wonderfully developed, for the movements of fish at great distances could be detected by the underwater ears. A line of taste organs along either bilge responded to the ever-changing composition of the water, and enabled the hunter to track his prey. Delicacy of hearing and of taste combined with omnivorous habits, and with great diversity of behavior and strong sociality to favor the growth of intelligence. Speech, that essential medium of the developed mentality, had two distinct modes in this world. For short-range communication, rhythmic underwater emissions of gas from a vent in the rear of the organism were heard and analyzed by means of underwater ears. Long-distance communication was carried on by means of semaphore signals from a rapidly agitating tentacle at the masthead. The organizing of communal fishing expeditions, the invention of traps, the making of lines and nets, the practice of agriculture, both in the sea and along the shores, the building of stone harbors and workshops, the use of volcanic heat for smelting metals and of wind for driving mills, the projection of canals into the low islands in search of minerals and fertile ground, the gradual exploration and mapping of a huge world, the harnessing of solar radiation for mechanical power, these and many other achievements were at once a product of intelligence and an opportunity for its advancement. It was a strange experience to enter the mind of an intelligent ship, to see the foam circling under one's own nose as the vessel plunged through the waves, to taste the bitter or delicious current streaming past one's flanks, to feel the pressure of air on the sails as one beat up against the breeze, to hear beneath the waterline the rush and murmur of distant shoals of fishes, and indeed actually to hear the sea bottom's configuration by means of the echoes that it cast up to the underwater ears. It was strange and terrifying to be caught in a hurricane, to feel the masts straining and the sails threatening to split, while the hull was battered by the small but furious waves of that massive planet. It was strange, too, to watch other great living ships as they plowed their way, heeled over, adjusted the set of their yellow or russet sails to the wind's variations. And very strange it was to realize that these were not man-made objects, but themselves conscious and purposeful. Sometimes we saw two of the living ships fighting, tearing at one another's sails with snake-like tentacles, stabbing at one another's soft decks with metal knives, or at a distance firing at one another with cannon. Bewildering and delightful it was to feel in the presence of a slim female clipper the longing for contact, and to carry out with her on the high seas the tacking and yawing, the piratical pursuit and overhauling, the delicate, fleeting caress of tentacles which formed the love play of this race. Strange to come up alongside, close-hauled, grapple her to one's flank, and board her with sexual invasion. It was charming, too, to see a mother-ship attended by her children. I should mention, by the way, that at birth the young were launched from the mother's decks like little boats, one from the port side, one from the starboard. Thenceforth they were suckled at her flanks. In play they swam about like little ducklings, or spread their immature sails. In rough weather and for long voyages they were taken aboard. At the time of our visit, natural sails were beginning to be aided by a power unit and propeller which were fixed to the stem. Great cities of concrete docks had spread along many of the coasts, and were excavated out of the hinterlands. We were delighted by the broad waterways that served as streets in these cities. They were thronged with sail and mechanized traffic, the children appearing as tugs and smacks among the gigantic elders. It was in this world that we found in its most striking form a social disease which is perhaps the commonest of all world diseases, namely the splitting of the population into two mutually unintelligible castes through the influence of economic forces. So great was the difference between adults of the two castes that they seemed to us at first to be a distinct species, and we supposed ourselves to be witnessing the victory of a new and superior biological mutation over its predecessor. But this was far from the truth. In appearance, the masters were very different from the workers, quite as different as queen ants and drones from the workers of their species. They were more elegantly and accurately streamlined. They had a greater expanse of sail, and were faster in fair weather. In heavy seas they were less seaworthy, owing to their finer lines, but on the other hand they were the more skillful and venturesome navigators. Their manipulatory tentacles were less muscular, but capable of finer adjustments. Their perception was more delicate. While a small minority of them perhaps excelled the best of the workers in endurance and courage, most were much less hardy both physically and mentally. They were subject to a number of disintegrative diseases which never affected the workers, chiefly diseases of the nervous system. On the other hand, if any of them contracted one of the infectious ailments which were endemic to the workers but seldom fatal, he would almost certainly die. They were also very prone to mental disorders, and particularly to neurotic self-importance. The whole organization and control of the world was theirs. The workers, on the other hand, though racked by disease and neurosis bred of their cramping environment, were on the whole psychologically more robust. They had, however, a crippling sense of inferiority. Though in handicrafts and all small-scale operations they were capable of intelligence and skill, they were liable, when faced with tasks of a wider scope, to a strange paralysis of mind. The mentalities of the two castes were indeed strikingly different. The masters were more prone to individual initiative and to the vices of self-seeking. The workers were more addicted to collectivism and the vices of subservience to the herd's hypnotic influence. The masters were on the whole more prudent, far-seeing, independent, self-reliant. The workers were more impetuous, more ready to sacrifice themselves in a social cause, more often clearly aware of the right aims of social activity, and incomparably more generous to individuals in distress. At the time of our visit, certain recent discoveries were throwing the world into confusion. Hitherto it had been supposed that the natures of the two castes were fixed unalterably, by divine law and by biological inheritance, but it was now certain that this was not the case, and that the physical and mental differences between the classes were due entirely to nurture. Since time immemorial, the castes had been recruited in a very curious manner. After weaning, all children born on the port side of the mother, no matter what the parental caste, were brought up to be members of the master caste. All those born on the starboard side were brought up to be workers. Since the master class had, of course, to be much smaller than the working class, this system gave it immense superfluity of potential masters. The difficulty was overcome as follows. The starboard-born children of workers and the port-born children of masters were brought up by their own respective parents, but the port-born, potentially aristocratic children of workers were mostly dispersed of by infant sacrifice. A few only were exchanged with the starboard-born children of the masters. With the advance of industrialism, the increasing need for large supplies of cheap labor, the spread of scientific ideas, and the weakening of religion, came the shocking discovery that port-born children of both classes, if brought up as workers, became physically and mentally indistinguishable from workers. Industrial magnates in need of plentiful cheap labor now developed moral indignation against infant sacrifice, urging that the excess of port-born infants should be mercifully brought up as workers. Presently, certain misguided scientists made the even more subversive discovery that starboard-born children brought up as masters developed the fine lines, the great sails, the delicate constitution, the aristocratic mentality of the master caste. An attempt was made by the masters to prevent this knowledge from spreading to the workers, but certain sentimentalists of their own caste brooded it abroad and preached a new-fangled and inflammatory doctrine of social equality. During our visit, the world was in terrible confusion. In backward oceans, the old system remained unquestioned, but in all the more advanced regions of the planet, a desperate struggle was being waged. In one great archipelago, a social revolution had put the workers in power, and a devoted though ruthless dictatorship was attempting to plan the life of the community that the next generation should be homogeneous and of a new type, combining the most desirable characters of both workers and masters. Elsewhere, the masters had persuaded their workers that the new ideas were false and base, and certain to lead to a universal poverty and misery. A clever appeal was made to the vague but increasing suspicion that the materialistic science was misleading and superficial, and that mechanized civilization was crushing out the more spiritual potentialities of the race. Skilled propaganda spread the idea of a corporate state with port and starboard flanks, correlated by a popular dictator who, it was said, would assume power by divine right and the will of the people. I must not stay to tell of the desperate struggle which broke out between these two kinds of social organizations. In the worldwide campaigns, many a harbor, many an ocean current flowed red with slaughter. Under the pressure of a war to the death, all that was best, all that was most human and gentle on each side, was crushed out by military necessity. On the one side, the passion for a unified world where every individual should live a free and full life in service of the world community was overcome by the passion to punish spies, traitors, and heretics. On the other, vague and sadly misguided yearnings for a nobler, less materialistic life were cleverly transformed by the reactionary leaders into vindictiveness against the revolutionaries. Very rapidly the material fabric of civilization fell to pieces. Not till the race had reduced itself to an almost subhuman savagery, and all the crazy traditions of a diseased civilization had been purged away, along with true culture, could the spirit of these shipmen set out again on the great adventure of the spirit. Many thousands of years later it broke through onto that higher plane of being which I have still to suggest as best I may.